We've got before us, starting in Ezekiel 35, an amazing section of Scripture. I believe that Ezekiel 35 to 48 is the longest continuous section of latter-day prophecy in the whole of the Scriptures. Yes, the book of Revelation is longer than this section in Ezekiel, but there are quite a number of sections of Revelation that have already been fulfilled. The vast majority of what is before us in Ezekiel 35 to 48 has yet to come to pass. It's about the time of the end. So there's quite a challenge before us in considering these 15 chapters. And there's all sorts of interesting questions that come up out of these chapters. So chapter 35, what or who are Mt Seir and Idumea? We're going to have a look at that tonight and hopefully resolve that one. Chapter 37, how exactly is the Valley of Dry Bones prophecy fulfilled? That's on your program, I believe, for next year. And chapter 38, in what circumstances do Israel dwell without walls, bars and gates? That's one that's been puzzling us for quite a while, but it's there in Ezekiel 38. What I want to try and establish tonight before we get into chapter 35 is how do we view this series of prophecies, these 15 chapters? How do they relate to one another? Are they a sequence of events, starting in chapter 35 with God's judgment on Mt Seir and ending with the building of the millennial temple? Is that how this section works? And if they're not a chronological sequence of events, well, how do they relate together? How do they fit together? So let's just start with an overview, just to get into our minds what we've got before us. So Ezekiel 35, which we've just read, is clearly against Mt Seir, Idumea, and we'll see a bit later on exactly what Idumea is. Chapter 36 is a prophecy directed to the mountains of Israel, and it talks about the spiritual restoration of the whole nation of Israel. Chapter 37, which we probably know pretty well, starts off with the Valley of Dry Bones prophecy, then the two sticks, the coming of the king, and ends with the building of the temple. 38 is the invasion of Gog, and 39 the utter defeat of Gog and the complete restoration of Israel. And then chapters 40 to 48 we have the details of the temple that we read of being built in the end of chapter 37. So how do we work out how these chapters fit together? You know, as a piece of Bible study, how do we as Bible students go about it? Well, I suggest the way to do it is to look at the detail in the chapters. So, Ezekiel chapter 35 and verse 4. Speaking against Mt Seir, I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate, and thou shalt know that I am Yahweh. So there's a phrase. Let's follow that through. Verse 15. As thou didst rejoice at the inheritance of the house of Israel because it was desolate, so will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mt Seir, and all Idumea, even all of it, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. So in verse 4, it's clearly Mt Seir, it's Edom, it's Idumea. The end of the chapter, it's they. Sounds like other people. They shall know that I am Yahweh. Now into chapter 36 and verse 23. I will sanctify my great name, which was profaned among the heathen, which ye, Israel, have profaned in the midst of them. And the heathen shall know that I am Yahweh, saith the Lord Yahweh, when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes. So when Israel becomes God's holy people, the heathen will know God is Yahweh. That's chapter 36. Now chapter 37. End of the chapter. Verse 27. My tabernacle also shall be with them, yea, I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And the heathen shall know that I Yahweh do sanctify Israel, when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore. So the heathen know that he is Yahweh when Israel is sanctified. Chapter 38 and verse 23. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, so this is the destruction of Gog, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. So this is the nations. And chapter 39 and verse 7. So will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. I will not let them pollute my holy name any more, and the heathen shall know that I am Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. So that refrain almost runs through these chapters. Now when you look at that concept, all the nations of this world in which we live, knowing that there is only one God and his name is Yahweh, that's part of the great climax of the purpose of God upon the earth. The knowledge of him shall fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. So this really is the great climax of the purpose of God at the beginning of the millennium. Now, we've got 6 occurrences of that phrase in these chapters, 35 to 39. Does that climax occur 6 times? Do the heathen know that he is Yahweh and then forget it and then learn it again and again and again? Clearly not. All of these passages which we've read are all referring to one event, which is the great climax of the many events that are described in this prophecy. That at the end of it all, the heathen know that he is Yahweh. So clearly the chapters are not a chronological sequence, because this phrase runs right through from 35 verse 4 to 39 verse 7. So that's one way to demonstrate that they're not chronological. Let's have a look at another one now. Ezekiel 36 is about the physical and spiritual restoration of Israel. Without treading too much on the toes of the next class. Verse 24, I will take you from among the heathen, bring you into your own land. Verse 25, I'll sprinkle clean water upon you, you shall be clean from all your filthiness. 26, a new heart will I give you. 27, I will put my spirit in you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. And at the end of the chapter, in verse 38, they're called the holy flock. They are God's sheep, and he is their shepherd. That's the point that we reach in Ezekiel 36. But when we turn the page, as it were, to chapter 37, we find the whole house of Israel are a collection of very dry bones who say, our bones are dried, our hope is lost. Clearly, that's not a sequence. Those chapters cannot be chronological. Then look at the end of chapter 37, which we've already briefly looked at. Verse 26, God says, I'll make a covenant of peace with Israel. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them. I'll place them and multiply them, and set my sanctuary in the midst of them for evermore. My tabernacle also shall be with them. And if you trace those words forward, those words sanctuary and tabernacle are used in the description of the temple in chapters 40 to 48. So clearly it is the millennial temple that's being referred to here at the end of chapter 37. This is when it's constructed. But in chapter 38, we've got the greatest earthquake the world has ever seen, when every wall falls to the ground. Including the walls of the newly built temple? Surely not. So again, the earthquake of Ezekiel 38 cannot take place after the building of the temple. It must be before. So what we've got here in these chapters in Ezekiel is a series of visions depicting different aspects of latter-day events which God is going to bring to pass upon the earth. And each of these visions leads up to the same point, that the heathen know, the nations know, that he is Yahweh. So what is the sequence? Well, here's my suggestion. I welcome discussion and contributions afterwards. I believe that the sequence starts in Ezekiel 37 verse 15 with the planting of the stick of Judah in the land. And we've seen that. That bit is already fulfilled. They're there, therefore the mountains are called the mountains of Israel. The next stage is preparing the scene for Gog. I believe Brother Jeff Cave did a lecture here a little while ago in which he identified 16 details in Ezekiel 38 that have already come to pass, that are already there in the Middle East. The scene is being prepared for Gog, and that's where we are now in the sequence, as we watch, as it were, the angels moving the pieces around the chessboard to prepare for the great event that Ezekiel 38 describes, the invasion of Gog and his hosts upon the mountains of Israel. About that time, we've got the rise of Edom, and we'll see why that is later on. Then we've got the actual invasion of Gog and his destruction, chapter 38 and on into chapter 39. And then I believe we have the revival of the dry bones, Ezekiel 38 verse 1 to 14. Followed by the joining together of the two sticks in Ezekiel 37, and the spiritual restoration of the whole of Israel in chapter 36. Then we have, and we'll try and establish this from other prophecies later on, the destruction of Edom, and finally the building of the temple. So there's my suggested sequence of these chapters. And what actually happens is Ezekiel 37 verses 15 to the end are the framework, and what we've got to do is slide the other chapters into that section and build up the sequence. So there's the outline of what you have before you in this study of Ezekiel in the class. So let's go back now to Ezekiel 35 and focus on our particular subject tonight, which is Mt Seir, Edom and Idumea. Sorry, one last bit. Temple built, all nations acknowledge Yahweh, which is what we saw earlier on. Right, so Edom. Edom, Hebrew word, it comes from the word Adon, which means red. And we remember that when Esau was born, he came out red all over. So, hence, Esau. Now, that word Edom, the Hebrew word Edom, is transliterated Edom 87 times, Edomites 9 times, and Idumea 4 times. So when we meet Idumea in the text of Scripture, it is actually Edom. So end of chapter 35 talks about all Idumea. It's really all Edom. And they are the people who are descended from Esau, because God has said in Genesis 36, Esau is Edom. So that's who they are. Now what about Mt Seir that we read about in verse 2 of chapter 35? Well, the English word Seir comes from the Hebrew word Seir, and that comes from a root word which means to be shaggy as a he-goat. So the Seir word is translated Seir 39 times, and that's it. The other word, the root word, is translated kid 28 times, goat 24 times, and twice in Genesis 27, when Rebekah puts the skins of the goat upon Jacob to disguise him as his brother. And Jacob says, my brother is a hairy man. And what he's saying is, my brother's a goat man. You know, his hair's like the hair of a goat. My father will work me out in no time at all. And God says in Deuteronomy, I have given Mt Seir unto Esau. So when we read about Mt Seir, when we read about Edom, when we read about Idumea, it's focusing our minds on the descendants of Esau and that particular territory, and we'll see it on a map later, that God gave to him. Now, what was the relationship between the Edomites and the Israelites? Well, we know that Esau hated Jacob, particularly when Jacob had, in Esau's view, stolen the blessing which he wanted, and Esau threatened to kill Jacob after Isaac's death. The Edomites threatened Israel as they journeyed to the land. So when Israel came up out of Egypt and came through the wilderness, they started going up the King's Highway on the east side of Jordan, and the Edomites said, don't you dare put a foot on our land or we'll come out against you. And if we find the prophecy of Obadiah, we find that when Israel were in trouble, the Edomites played the role of the hyenas following on after the lion. So Obadiah, give you a minute to find it, and once you've found it, put a marker there, because we should be coming back later, so we don't need to try and find Obadiah twice if we put a marker in there. So Obadiah verse 10, and it's addressed to Edom. Verse 1, the vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. So verse 10, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, and the word violence incidentally is Hamas, we know about them, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou wast as one of them. But thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother in the day that he became a stranger. Neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of thy calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. So that was the role that Edom played. As I say, it's like the hyenas coming behind the lion and taking the pickings. But it illustrates the animosity between the Edomites and the Israelites. And that goes right through the Old Testament. And I believe that Obadiah has got at least 2 historical fulfillments when the Edomites did that. But eventually the Jews overcame them. So Josephus records that John Hyrcanus, if I pronounce his name correctly, who was the high priest and also the military leader of the Jews at that time, subdued the Idumeans, the Edomites, made them circumcise and keep the law. And Josephus says they were hereafter no other than Jews. So they were proselytes under some degree of duress. And of course the Herods were Idumeans. They were Edomites. But eventually they disappear from history. And today the city of Petra, where they used to live, is just a tourist site. There is not even a hotel there. The tourists are bussed in, they go around, they take their photographs, they look at the amazing construction and this red rock out of which Petra was carved, and they get back on the bus and they go back from whence they came. And that's it. That's all that's left of Edom today. There is no people there that can be identified with the biblical Edomites. But it's abundantly clear from Scripture that there is a latter-day Edom. And it's proved by these passages. So let's look at Ezekiel 35 and verse 5. So this is addressed to Mt Seir, the territory of Edom. Because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword, in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. That's latter day. That's Ezekiel 36, the spiritual restoration. Verse 9, I will make thee perpetual desolations, and thy city shall not return, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. There's our phrase again. Because thou hast said, these 2 nations and these 2 countries shall be mine, and we will possess it, whereas Yahweh was there. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, I will even do according to thine anger and according to thine envy which thou hast used out of thy hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I have judged thee. And thou shalt know that I am Yahweh. And verse 14, 15 we've already looked at. When the whole earth rejoiceth, I will make thee desolate. So that's clearly latter day. There is a Mt Seir, there is an Edom. Ezekiel 36 verse 1. Prophesy unto the mountains of Israel, and say, Hear ye the word of Yahweh. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, because the enemy hath said against you, Aha! Even the ancient high places are ours in possession. Therefore prophesy and say, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, because they have made you desolate, and swallowed you up on every side, that ye might be a possession unto the residue of the heathen, ye are taken up in the lips of talkers, and an infamy of the people. And who's doing this? Verse 5. Therefore thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen, and against all Idumea, Edom, which have appointed my land to their possession, with the joy of all their heart, with despiteful minds to cast it out for a prey. So they want the land. They don't want the Jews to have it. They want it for their own possession in a latter-day context. Then there's Obadiah again. So back to the marker. Obadiah and verse 15. So we've got the historical section up to verse 14. And then verse 15. For the day of Yahweh is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Verse 17. But upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. So this is future. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau for stubble. And they shall kindle in them and devour them. There shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for Yahweh hath spoken it. Verse 21. And Saviours shall come up upon Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be Yahweh's. So there's no doubt from these passages there is a latter-day Edom. And one more, Joel chapter 3 also mentions Edom. So Joel chapter 3, I believe the return of Christ to manifest himself to Israel. So he's already come, called the saints, the judgment's taken place. But when he comes with the saints to manifest himself to Israel, that occurs in between verses 15 and 16 of Joel 3. So then, verse 16, Yahweh shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth shall shake. But Yahweh will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. And it goes on to talk about the kingdom. And then it says in verse 19, Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness for the violence, Hamas again, against the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in the land. So again, in Joel 3, in the context of Christ and the saints coming to Jerusalem, Israel being delivered, Edom is going to be a desolate wilderness. So of course that leaves us with the question, who is the latter-day Edom? Because if we look at the map of the Middle East, the modern map of the Middle East, to a degree drawn up 100 years ago by Mark Sykes and Monsieur Georges Picot in the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which Britain and France sought to carve up the Ottoman Empire between them. Well, there's the result. There's the map of the Middle East. And Egypt is there, and Libya is there, and Syria is there, and Lebanon is there. All biblical names, biblical territories, with the same people, same national identity, living in those territories as was in Bible times. But search the map as much as you like, there is no Edom. The territory which Edom used to occupy is not identifiable as a national entity on the map today. So, who is the latter-day Edom? Well, Brother Thomas proposed, and Brother Mansfield in his verse by verse follows Brother Thomas's views. Brother Thomas proposed that it would be a group of anti-Semitic Gentile nations which would defeat Israel at the time of the end. And one of the arguments he uses to support that is the quotation by James in Acts 15 from Amos, where Amos has Edom, and James, by the Spirit, interprets it in his context as being the Gentiles. So in Eureka Volume 1, Brother Thomas wrote, Edom in the latter days is representative of the enemies of Jacob, banded together under Gog, who is then chief of the house of Esau. That was his view in Eureka Volume 1, 1860s. Now, it's really, when you look at the map, it's really hardly surprising that he came to that sort of view, because that's what the world looked like in his day. All of that territory, Israel, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Syria, Egypt, etc., was all part of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Sultan in Istanbul. There were no separate nations. I mean, Egypt was sort of there, ruled by a caliph, but he was under the thrall of the Sultan. So it's hardly surprising that Brother Thomas couldn't identify individual national powers in that territory at the time when he wrote Eureka. So there's our bit of territory that we need to do something with or find out something about. So that's Brother Thomas's view. There is a modern Christadelphian view about, which suggests that Edom is part of a 10 Arab nation group which defeats Israel at the time of the end. And Psalm 83 is quoted in support of this. Serious problems with that exposition are that the 10 nations identified in Psalm 83 are not even all Semitic, let alone all Arab nations. And the end of the psalm does not end up with the defeat of Israel, it ends up with the defeat of Israel's enemies. Psalm 83 is much more applicable to the time of Jehoshaphat than it is to events in the latter days. And the suggestion also, without scriptural foundation, is that the 10 toes of the image of Daniel chapter 2 are 10 Arabic toes who defeat Israel at the time of the end. That really doesn't work out. So we have a problem. There's the Ottoman Empire in 1914. It's already started to contract, and the darker brown areas are all that was left of the Sultan by 1914. Let's go to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. An amazing angelic intervention in the political affairs of the United Kingdom in the early 1870s. Baldwin was Prime Minister, and he called a snap election, as British Prime Ministers can, and I believe that he said to the populace, if you re-elect me, I will abolish income tax. Now, I've no idea what the rate of income tax was in those days, but it sounds like a good sweetener for a bit of election bribery. But the angels were at work, and Baldwin did not get re-elected. A certain Benjamin Disraeli, as far as I can tell, the only Jew who's ever sat in 10 Downing Street, became the British Prime Minister. And within a very short time, he borrowed £4 million worth of 1871 money from the Rothschilds Bank and bought about half of the shares in the Suez Canal. And that made Britain de facto ruler of Egypt, because Egypt was in great debt to Britain, and Britain put financial advisors in. Disraeli only lasted 5 years, and a year after he was defeated in the next election, he was dead. But the angels had put him there to do that work, and much as Baldwin and successive prime ministers wanted to get Britain out of Egypt, they were unable to do so, because the angels had determined that, Daniel 11 verse 40, at the time of the end, there would be a king of the south who would push at him. And of course that's what happened almost 100 years ago to today. 100 years ago today, Allenby was in the land, he was fighting. And he was pushing north, heading for, first of all, Jerusalem, and then, of course, later on, Damascus. And he pushed the Turk out of the land. So that's the first stage. The second stage is that the king of the north is going to come against him. And the him there is still Turkey, because Russia wants Constantinople back. Hagia Sophia, the chief basilica of their religion. It's now a museum, but they want it to become an Eastern Orthodox church again. And of course, when he's done that, we know from Scripture he's going to come into the glorious land, as verse 41 says. But note the detail. Verse 41 of Daniel 11. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. So when the king of the north comes down, on the east side of Jordan, there's going to be an Edom, and a Moab, and an Ammon, against whom the king of the north is not going to move militarily. They're not his target, but they're going to be there. Now go to Isaiah and chapter 11. So Daniel 11 is telling us that there's going to be an Edom, where Edom always was, and it's going to be there in the latter days when the king of the north invades. So now let's go to Isaiah chapter 11. Clearly, again, a latter day prophecy. We've only got to look at verses 6 to 9 about the wolf and the lamb dwelling together and the child playing on the hole of the asp. So, forgot that bit of the slide, but there we are. When the king of the north comes down, there's going to be an Edom. So, Isaiah 11 and verse 14. They. Who's the they? Well, go back to verse 12. He shall set up an ensign for the nations, shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Because as you can imagine, when the king of the north, when Gog comes down upon the mountains of Israel, Jews are going to flee in every direction that they can. Just as many fled when Sennacherib came in the days of Hezekiah. And once the threat was lifted, those people were able to come back. And it's going to be exactly the same in the latter days. And then verse 13. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. So now we've got the two sticks, Judah and Israel, of Ezekiel 37 verse 15 onwards, joined together in the land, just as they were in the days of Isaiah, when there was the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. So they're going to be there, as we've read in Ezekiel. They're going to be one nation. They're not going to be divided into two nations anymore at all. There's going to be no envy. There's going to be no vexation between them. They're going to be one people. Verse 14. They shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. That's the Gaza Strip. That's identified, as we shall see in a minute or two, in Obadiah. It's also identified in Joel chapter 3, in the early part of the chapter, as all the coasts of Palestine, who are going to sell Jews into slavery at the time when the king of the north, when Gog, comes down into the land. So Ephraim and Judah together are going to fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. Then, continuing in the verse, they shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. So there's an Edom and a Moab and an Ammon there, where those ancient nations were, on the east side of Jordan. So these passages are telling us that some violently anti-Israel power must possess the ancient territory of Mt Seir at the time of the end. Now, we've seen how rapidly things can change and develop in the Middle East. We saw the rise of ISIS, which took over great chunks of Syria and Iraq. We've seen how quickly the power of Russia went into Syria. So, who is in this territory now? Well, it's what's known as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It's not a stable country. The threat of ISIS has pretty well disappeared. but there are plenty of other jihadist threats in that area. Jordan is ruled by King Abdullah, who I think is the great or great-great-grandson of the original Abdullah, who took over the territory which was once known as Transjordan, because they had the West Bank as well at the time. And that family has ruled Jordan ever since 1917 period, when the original King Abdullah was set up by the British. But Abdullah and his country of Jordan are viewed with contempt by fundamentalist Islamists, because Jordan has made a peace deal with Israel. And Israel has given the Kingdom of Jordan control over the Temple Mount and the two Muslim holy shrines on the Temple Mount. So there's quite a reasonable relationship at the moment between Israel and Jordan. But 13% of the population of Jordan is Syrian refugees. Another 13% is Egyptian and Palestinian refugees. In fact, the total number of refugees in the Kingdom of Jordan is about 30% of the entire population. Imagine how Mrs. Merkel would feel if she was faced with that situation in Germany. So it's not a stable country. Abdullah's managing to control the country. He is popular with his own people and get much foreign aid. But things could, indeed, scripturally, things must change to fulfill Bible prophecy. So watch Jordan. So back to Ezekiel 35. Ezekiel 35 verse 1. Moreover, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Mt Seir, and prophesy against it, and say unto it, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, O Mount Seir, I am against thee. I will stretch out my hand against thee, and make thee most desolate. I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate. And thou shalt know that I am Yahweh, because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword, in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. So God is against this people because of the attitude to Israel. And notice the address of the prophecy is Mt Seir rather than Edom. So it's geographical rather than referring to a people. So that's confirming what's happened in history. The ancient Edomites have disappeared, but there is going to be a people with the same attitude of the ancient Edomites occupying their territory in the latter days. And just compare what we've read in verse 5 with the Hamas Charter of 1988. The individual duty of every Muslim is jihad. And it's because the Jews have usurped Palestine. It's compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. It's necessary to instill the spirit of jihad in the heart of the nation so that they would confront the enemies and join the ranks of the fighters. That's the spirit of these people who hate the Jews, who see the Jews as usurping their land and want to take it back again. And that parallels the passage in Joel that we read in Joel chapter 3, which singles out Edom because of their extreme violence against Israel. So verse 6 of Ezekiel 35, Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Since thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out and him that returneth. I will fill his mountains with his slain men. In thy hills and in thy valleys and in all thy rivers shall they fall that are slain with the sword. I will make thee perpetual desolations. That's Joel 3. And thy city shall not return, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. Because thou hast said, These two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it, whereas Yahweh was there. So God is recompensing them for the evil that they will have done to Israel. And notice the reference to two nations, two countries. That comes out in chapter 37 in the parable of the two sticks, which I believe is on your program for next year. verse 11. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, I will even do according to thine anger, and according to thine envy, which thou hast used out of thy hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I have judged thee. And thou shalt know that I am Yahweh, and that I have heard all thy blasphemies which thou hast spoken against the mountains of Israel, saying, they are laid desolate, they are given us to consume. Can you hear echoes in those verses of what's there on the screen? You know, that land's ours. The Jews have usurped it. We've got to raise jihad and take it back. God's actions are proportionate. What men do brings the level of his response. Just look at Ezekiel 18. And it's there all the way through the chapter. God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He wants the wicked to turn to him and live. But if a righteous man turns from his righteousness, then the wrath of God comes upon him. And those principles, brothers and sisters, are as true for us in these latter days as they will be for Edom in their territory at the time of the end. So there's no doubt that Edom is going to be judged. Just turn back to Ezekiel chapter 25 and verse 12. Ezekiel 25 verse 12. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, because that Edom hath dealt against the house of Judah by taking vengeance, and hath greatly offended and revenged himself upon them. Therefore thus saith the Lord Yahweh, I will also stretch out my hand upon Edom, and will cut off man and beast from it. I will make it desolate from Teman, and they of Dedan shall fall by the sword. And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel. And they shall do in Edom according to mine anger, and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, saith the Lord Yahweh. And that's exactly what we read in Isaiah 11 verse 14, that together they will go against Edom. And verse 15 is the other side of the equation, the Philistines, the Gaza Strip. Because the Philistines have dealt by revenge and have taken vengeance with a despiteful heart to destroy it for the old hatred. Therefore thus saith the Lord Yahweh, I will stretch out my hand upon the Philistines, and cut off the Kerathim, and destroy the remnant of the sea coast, and execute great vengeance upon them with furious rebukes, and they shall know that I am Yahweh, when I shall lay my vengeance upon them. I believe that some of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are even saying they're descended from the ancient Philistines, and therefore the territory is theirs rather than Israel's. So, if a power like ISIS were to take over southern Jordan, we would have the situation that's described in these prophecies, in the same territory, fueled by the same hatred for Israel, but not the main aggressor. The main aggressor comes from the north. When he comes, they will fulfill the role that ancient Edom took, after which God will use Israel as he metes out his judgments upon them. So if you've still got that marker in Obadiah, let's go back there again and look at the very exciting final section of Obadiah. Now, in 1947, when the formation of a Jewish state was being contemplated, the United Nations General Assembly got together and they passed Resolution 181, which is titled the UN Partition Plan for Palestine, echoing Joel chapter 3. They have parted my land. And they've been trying to do it ever since. You know, Mr. Bush's solution, etc., etc. After considerable debate, the UN General Assembly decided on partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem to be an internationalized city. And they published a map showing which territories were going to be given to the Jews and which territories were going to be given to the Arabs. And then Israel declared independence. And the 1948 war broke out. And it didn't quite go the way that most people had been expecting. And the map that they finished up with was quite different to the UN map. the 1948 borders of Israel. And that is where they were in 1948, in that sort of very light brown colour. Didn't have the Gaza Strip, didn't have the West Bank, didn't have the Golan Heights. 1967, of course, they took those territories. UN Resolution 267 demands that they return to the 1948 borders. Ariel Sharon in 2005 gave up the Gaza Strip. Earlier on than that, the Israelis had returned a lot of territory in the Negev to Egypt, but they've still got the West Bank and the Golan. Now, have a look at the geographical details in the end of Obadiah and just see what it's describing. Verse 19 of Obadiah. And they of the south shall possess the mount of Esau. So there it is, in territory which Israel have never had, but they're going to have it. And they of the plain, the Philistines, the Gaza Strip, which at the moment they have given up, but Obadiah and Isaiah and Joel all tell us is going to be part of the future borders of Israel. And they shall possess the fields of Ephraim and the fields of Samaria. That's the West Bank. And Benjamin shall possess Gilead. That's up in the northeast. Territory which was part of the territory of the 2.5 tribes, but which modern Israel have never set foot in. Verse 20. And the captivity of this host of the children of Israel shall possess that of the Canaanites, even to Zarephath. So that's up in Lebanon. Which again, Israel have never been, apart from the brief incursion into southern Lebanon. That's never been part of modern Israel. But it is part of the land promised to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And the captivity of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad, shall possess the cities of the south. That's the Negev, which they conquered in 1967 and have then given back to Egypt. And incidentally, in Zechariah chapter 10, when it talks about the second stage of the restoration, the second stick of Ezekiel 37, when those Jews come back, they're going to go into Gilead and Lebanon, says Zechariah 10. So the territory out of which Israel break out at the time of the end, as described in Obadiah, is almost exactly the 1948 borders of Israel. So it may be that military or political forces cause Israel to have to give up the West Bank. And if they do that, they'll be in exactly the position that these verses in Obadiah describe, out of which they will break out. And these verses in Obadiah parallel the last verses of Ezekiel 35, verses 14 and 15. So we're waiting, brothers and sisters, now for the time when the whole earth will rejoice in the goodness of God, when we will be there as those saviours upon Mount Zion that we read about in verse 21 of Obadiah, with the Lord Jesus Christ. And this is the great climax which Ezekiel 35 leads us to, as the other visions will do, as you look at them in future classes.